Marty Lagina was standing completely still. The excavation around him continued. Equipment was operating, workers were moving, and the dig was still active. But Marty did not move. He stood at the edge of what the team had just uncovered, saying nothing. That single image, a man who has pushed this investigation forward for more than a decade, suddenly standing motionless while everything around him continued, is where this story begins. This is The Curse of Oak Island, Season 13, Episode 20. The episode is titled, Marty Lagina Finally Walks Away After Oak Island's Most Terrifying Discovery Ever. And that title is not simply dramatic wording. What the team discovered in this episode brought one of the most methodical, rational, and skeptical people in the entire investigation to a complete stop. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what the team discovered, why the discovery is important, and why even Marty Lagina could not immediately find a simple explanation for it. But before reaching that moment, there is something important we need to establish. We need to understand what was actually discovered. Not Marty's reaction, not the history surrounding it, but the discovery itself. Because unless you understand what a hidden tunnel beneath Oak Island represents from an engineering, historical, and physical perspective, the reaction does not fully make sense. This was not simply an unusual hole underground. It was something that would have required human beings to deliberately construct it, conceal it, and keep its existence hidden for an extraordinarily long period of time. A tunnel buried beneath Oak Island and apparently created centuries ago is far more than just another mysterious discovery. It represents a deliberate decision. People came to this island during a period when modern machinery, construction techniques, and infrastructure did not exist, and they created something beneath the surface. More importantly, whatever they constructed was apparently intended to remain hidden. That would have required planning, materials, manpower, and a considerable amount of effort. And once the construction was finished, keeping it secret would have required continued cooperation from everyone who knew about it. A hidden tunnel is therefore not simply an empty space beneath the ground. It represents intention. Someone decided that something was important enough to justify the effort required to build it, and the additional effort needed to conceal it. That is what makes the discovery in this episode so significant. The remarkable part is not simply that the team found a tunnel. It is that the tunnel appears to have been deliberately hidden, and for a very long time, it remained hidden. To understand why that discovery carries so much weight, we first need to understand the place where it was found. Oak Island is a small island located off the southern coast of Nova Scotia, Canada. On the surface, there is nothing particularly extraordinary about it. There are trees, shoreline, and a quiet coastal landscape. But beneath that ordinary-looking surface lies a mystery that has resisted answers for more than 2 centuries. The first documented account of unusual underground activity on Oak Island dates back to 1795. A young man named Daniel McGinnis noticed a circular depression in the ground. He began digging and eventually discovered a series of oak platforms positioned at regular intervals as the excavation went deeper. What was waiting at the bottom remained unknown, and the people who came after him were unable to solve that mystery either. Since that original excavation in 1795, Oak Island has been investigated again and again. People have lost their lives during attempts to uncover its secrets. Huge amounts of money have been invested without producing the expected answers. Excavations that appeared to be getting close to something important were repeatedly stopped by flooding, collapses, and the island's unusual underground system. That system includes flood tunnels that can allow seawater to enter the primary excavation area whenever digging reaches certain depths or disturbs particular underground structures. The central questions have remained the same for generations. What is beneath Oak Island? Who put it there? And why was it created? More than 200 years after the mystery first became known, those questions still have no definitive answer. Season 13 of The Curse of Oak Island appeared to bring the investigation closer to an explanation than ever before. But then, Episode 20 changed the nature of the mystery once again. Season 13 felt different almost immediately. That is not simply a dramatic observation. It is something that became noticeable to people who had followed the investigation throughout the show's run. The difference was not necessarily one single discovery. It was the way the investigation was being approached and where the team was choosing to concentrate its attention. In earlier seasons, the team explored a wide range of areas across Oak Island, both literally and figuratively. Multiple zones were investigated at the same time, with the team following clues in several directions in an effort to build a larger understanding of what might be hidden beneath the island. Season 13 became more focused. The investigation was no longer spread as widely as before. Instead, the team began concentrating on specific targets. By this point, they had developed a clearer understanding of the underground geography than they had in any previous season. That growing picture was directing them toward particular locations, specific depths, and possible connections between areas that had previously been treated as separate mysteries. The investigation became more precise, the collection of data became more organized, and the overall atmosphere among the team began to change. They had learned over many seasons not to get excited too quickly. Still, there was a noticeable feeling that the scattered pieces of the mystery were finally beginning to fit together into something that made sense. Every discovery in Season 13 seemed to lead somewhere. Each reading, core sample, and radar scan added another piece to the picture. With every episode, the underground layout became a little clearer. By the time episode 20 arrived, the evidence had become strong enough that the discovery beneath the ground was not completely unexpected from the perspective of the data. Instead, it was a confirmation. The information had been pointing the team toward this location. What they did not know was exactly what they would find when they finally reached it. Another important part of this discovery is the location itself. The area where the tunnel was confirmed was not new to the investigation. The team had been studying and examining this part of Oak Island in different ways for several seasons. It lies within a corridor between the Money Pit area, which has remained the main focus of Oak Island searches for more than 2 centuries, and the Swamp, another location that has produced several important discoveries in more recent investigations. Previous work in and around this corridor had already produced evidence of human activity deep underground. Core samples had revealed disturbed layers of soil. Timber fragments had appeared in places where constructed features were suspected. Other readings indicated the possible presence of underground spaces, although they had not provided enough information to determine exactly what those spaces were. In other words, this section of the island had been giving investigators clues for a long time. The problem was that those clues had never been clear enough to provide a definite direction. Season 13 changed that. Through the combined results of the team's careful and methodical work, the underground evidence became clear enough to follow. The corridor between the Money Pit and the Swamp had always been considered potentially important because of what an underground connection between those 2 locations could mean. The Money Pit has traditionally been viewed as the center of the island's main underground system. The Swamp, meanwhile, has been suggested to be more than a naturally occurring feature. Evidence has raised the possibility that parts of it may have been deliberately constructed or modified, meaning it could have been connected to whatever larger system was created on the island. If a tunnel really connected the Money Pit area with the Swamp, it would not simply be an isolated passage beneath the ground. It would represent infrastructure. It would suggest that whoever created these underground features may have designed them as parts of a larger, connected system. Different structures could have been built to work together rather than existing as unrelated features. That is the larger context surrounding the tunnel discovery, and that context is just as important as the tunnel itself. The morning of episode 20 did not begin with any obvious sign that something extraordinary was about to happen. For anyone familiar with the show, a typical dig day on Oak Island follows a familiar routine. Equipment is inspected and positioned. The team gathers for its daily briefing. The day's objectives are discussed, along with the evidence directing them toward a particular location and the methods they intend to use. The discussion that morning was practical and detailed. There was no sense of panic or excitement. The team remained focused and patient. After spending so many years working on Oak Island, they understood that the island does not reveal its secrets simply because investigators want answers quickly. Rushing the process can create more problems than it solves, so patience has become an important part of the investigation. The area selected for that day's work was the corridor zone, the same general area that the accumulated evidence from Season 13 had been pointing toward throughout the previous episodes. Earlier ground-penetrating radar scans had identified unusual areas beneath the surface that deserved a closer look. Core drilling nearby had also produced physical evidence that appeared to support what the radar was showing. The team was therefore returning to an area they had been gradually working toward for some time. They already knew the data suggested that something was beneath the ground. What they did not know was that this particular day would provide the clearest confirmation they had received so far. Nothing about the morning gave away what was coming. The equipment was operating normally, the investigation was proceeding according to plan, and the team was simply doing what they had done countless times before. But beneath the ground, they were about to encounter something that would change the significance of the entire investigation. The ground looked exactly the way it had looked countless times before. Nothing seemed unusual on the surface, but at a particular depth and in a specific section of the target area, the equipment suddenly produced a different result. The change was not dramatic. With this kind of investigation, important discoveries do not always appear as obvious or spectacular signals. A ground-penetrating radar scan across the target area returned a signal pattern that was noticeably different from the surrounding ground. Ground-penetrating radar works by sending pulses beneath the surface and measuring the way those signals reflect back. Different types of material create different reflection patterns. Naturally settled soil tends to produce gradual and irregular results. A man-made structure, however, can produce a different kind of response, especially when it has defined boundaries, different materials, and the geometric consistency normally associated with construction. That was what made this particular radar reading stand out. Instead of showing the irregular pattern expected from natural geology, the signal appeared to have a much more defined shape. The edges looked unusually consistent. The depth appeared regular. Even the dimensions suggested by the scan seemed too uniform to easily explain as a natural formation. The team did not simply accept the first reading. They ran the scan again from another direction. The signal remained. That made it much harder to dismiss as simple equipment interference. It also did not match a known geological feature that the team had already identified. Something different appeared to be there. More importantly, it was located at the depth and within the area where the Season 13 evidence had been increasingly pointing. The next step was to test the radar result physically through core drilling. A drill would be sent down toward the depth indicated by the radar, allowing the team to retrieve samples from the layers it passed through. Those samples could either support the radar interpretation or raise more questions. The drill went down, and the samples were brought back to the surface. The first significant result was a noticeable change in the soil at precisely the depth highlighted by the radar. Instead of undisturbed natural layers, the material appeared disturbed. It looked as though the soil had been removed and later placed back rather than forming naturally over time. And there was something else inside that disturbed layer. Wood. This was not simply a random piece of timber. Its position and consistency suggested that it may have been part of a constructed feature. Even though the evidence came from a relatively small core sample, it indicated that something had been deliberately built beneath the ground. Something was there. Something was buried deep underground, and whatever it was, appeared to be old. At this point, the evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to explain as a natural formation. The existence of the tunnel was not established through one single dramatic discovery. Instead, it was confirmed through several pieces of evidence that gradually pointed towards the same conclusion. The radar provided the first indication. The core samples then supplied physical evidence suggesting construction beneath the surface. The team continued drilling at additional points along the direction indicated by the radar. The results continued to match. Again and again, they encountered disturbed soil. Again and again, there were indications of placed material, and the evidence continued to follow a consistent depth along a clearly defined path. This was no longer looking like a single isolated underground anomaly. It appeared to be a linear feature, something extended beyond one specific location. It had a direction and a clear continuation. That distinction was extremely important. A single buried structure could potentially have many explanations, but something that extends from one location toward another suggests purpose. It suggests that whoever created it intended for it to connect different points underground. As more evidence emerged, the physical characteristics of the feature also appeared consistent with deliberate construction. Its depth remained relatively consistent. The material evidence appeared along its length, and the condition and type of the wood, combined with the surrounding soil, provided further indications that the structure was not a recent creation. The team could also compare the recovered material with other old timber and archaeological evidence discovered on Oak Island during the previous 13 seasons. Those comparisons placed the feature well outside the modern era. It clearly predated the documented investigations that began with the famous discoveries of the late 18th century. In other words, this was not something created by a previous excavation crew. It was not part of a modern drilling operation. It had been underground for a very long time. And despite all the excavation and investigation that had taken place on Oak Island since 1795, the feature had remained hidden until now. There was still an important question that could not be answered simply by looking at the material in the field. Exactly how old was the tunnel? A precise date would require laboratory testing and scientific analysis of the recovered material. But the evidence available to the team at the site already established something important. The tunnel was old. The condition of the wood was consistent with long-term preservation in the waterlogged underground environment found on Oak Island. Other ancient timber recovered during the many seasons of excavation had shown similar preservation characteristics. So while the exact age still required further testing, the field evidence strongly indicated that this was not a modern structure. It had been hidden beneath Oak Island for generations. The constant moisture beneath Oak Island may actually help preserve organic material under certain conditions. Instead of allowing wood to decay quickly, the waterlogged environment can slow the deterioration process, allowing timber to survive for periods of time that would be impossible in ordinary dry soil. Wood recovered from deep underground on Oak Island has previously been dated to periods reaching back into the colonial era, and in some cases, even earlier. The material associated with this tunnel displayed preservation characteristics similar to some of the oldest timber previously recovered from the island. The construction itself also provided clues about its possible age. The way the timber had been shaped, the tool marks visible across the wooden surfaces, and the methods used to join different pieces together all appeared consistent with older, pre-industrial construction techniques. These details are significant because they are not random characteristics. They reflect the tools and methods used by people during particular historical periods. Taken together, the available evidence suggested that the structure could have been built considerably earlier than the earliest documented human activity associated with this particular area of Oak Island. Exactly how much earlier was something the field evidence could not establish with certainty, but it appeared to be old enough to raise a much bigger question. Who built it? That question becomes difficult because the modern historical record does not provide an obvious answer. Throughout the long history of Oak Island investigations, several major theories have been proposed about the people who may have constructed the underground features. 3 possibilities have received particular attention. Each theory has some historical basis. Each also has serious weaknesses. The tunnel does not prove that any one of these theories is correct, but it does provide another piece of physical evidence that supporters of each theory can point toward, and that critics will have to explain. The first and perhaps simplest possibility is colonial-era construction. According to this theory, the underground structures may have been created sometime during the 1600s or 1700s by people whose identities have never been established. The purpose may have been to hide valuables during a period when the Atlantic world was experiencing considerable instability. One popular version of this theory involves pirates. During that period, ships traveling through Atlantic waters had access to significant amounts of wealth. Some crews also possessed detailed knowledge of the Nova Scotia coastline. For people carrying valuable goods that they wanted to keep hidden for long periods, a remote island could have offered an attractive location. The engineering required to construct Oak Island's underground features would have been impressive for any period, but it would not necessarily have been impossible for a well-organized and properly supplied group that had enough time, manpower, and knowledge of the local environment. This theory also fits with some of the dates suggested by material evidence recovered from the island. Its biggest weakness, however, is the lack of direct documentary evidence connecting a specific known group to Oak Island. The second possibility involves organized groups with particular historical motivations. Among the names frequently mentioned are the Freemasons, the Knights Templar, and other groups whose histories have been associated with the protection or concealment of important objects, documents, or valuables. Under some versions of these theories, the engineering capabilities attributed to such groups could potentially explain the sophisticated underground systems discovered on Oak Island. The Knights Templar, for example, were officially dissolved in the early 14th century. If they had possessed important treasures or documents, and those items had been moved elsewhere, there would have needed to be some secure destination. Supporters of this theory sometimes point to the complexity of Oak Island's underground flood system as evidence that the builders possessed considerable engineering knowledge. But this theory also faces a major problem. It requires a number of assumptions connecting the documented history of these organizations with the specific physical structures found on Oak Island. There is no clear historical record that directly establishes that connection. The third theory is perhaps the one that recent physical evidence has gradually made harder to dismiss. It suggests that at least some of the construction on Oak Island may predate European settlement and the beginning of the area's documented European history. In other words, the people responsible may have been present on the island before the arrival of the European historical record. Material recovered from Oak Island in recent seasons has produced dates that, in some interpretations, push parts of the island's activity further back in time than either the traditional pirate theory or the Knights Templar theory comfortably explains. If this tunnel belongs to that much earlier period, then identifying its builders becomes an entirely different problem. European historical records would not be enough to answer it. The investigation would have to be viewed through a completely different historical framework. That possibility is still being considered cautiously because its implications would extend far beyond the mystery of Oak Island itself. The tunnel has not proven this theory, but it has made it harder to simply dismiss. Regardless of which explanation eventually proves correct, there is one physical fact that remains difficult to ignore. This tunnel appears to have remained hidden for an extraordinarily long period of time. And that is remarkable for a very specific reason. Keeping a structure concealed for generations would have required much more than simply covering it with soil. It would have required the location, construction, and purpose of the feature to remain unknown or undiscovered despite centuries of natural changes, human activity, and repeated attempts to investigate the island. The fact that it remained hidden for so long tells us something important about how deliberately it may have been designed and concealed. Building a tunnel at this depth, using materials of this quality, in an underground environment as difficult as the one beneath Oak Island, would have required a considerable number of people working together over a substantial amount of time. Working deep underground in waterlogged soil is not a simple task. The builders would have had to control the water, keep the walls supported, position and secure the timber framework, and complete the entire process without leaving obvious signs of the work on the surface. That requires organization, experience, planning, and resources. Whoever built this was unlikely to have been a small group working without preparation. They would have needed to be capable, organized, and completely committed to whatever purpose the construction served. And then came the most difficult part. Once the work was finished, the people involved would have had to keep the entire operation secret. No surviving account clearly identifies the location. No known document provides a straightforward explanation of who constructed it or why. And despite more than 2 centuries of investigations by people specifically searching for hidden structures beneath Oak Island, the tunnel remained undiscovered. Investigators have used almost every kind of method imaginable over the years, from traditional hand excavation to explosives and eventually modern scanning and radar technology. Yet this particular structure stayed hidden. That is difficult to explain as simple luck. It suggests that the concealment was effective because it had been deliberately planned that way, and the effectiveness of that concealment tells us something about the people who created it. They understood the environment. They understood the challenges involved. They knew the island and the risks associated with building beneath it. Most importantly, they apparently believed that whatever they were protecting was important enough to justify all of that effort. When the tunnel was finally confirmed at the site, the cameras captured something that words alone cannot completely recreate. They captured the team in those first moments, before everyone had fully decided how to describe what they had just discovered. Before the careful explanations. Before the theories. Before anyone could confidently say what the discovery ultimately meant.